thank you to Pam and everyone for asking us to come today. Really appreciate it, and to talk to you guys and be part of the meeting. So.
All right, welcome. Thank you again for having us. And we were kind of given an open floor to talk about just about anything we wanted to, from pre-K through the upper school. So, wow, what spans that we do a lot of different kinds of things. I think one of the biggest things, obviously, reasons that you send your kids here to Country Day, and one of the biggest parts of our job is to help maximize the children's learning so that they remember for the long term, and they're able to remember and apply what they learn here at Country Day in their life beyond 12th grade. And so we wanted to talk a little bit about how to help your children with that process. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is on the front of your sheet, there's a little graphic there, and it's about how memory works in general. So I wanted to highlight that a little bit. The first part of memory is that every day in our life, we get all kinds of sensations, sensory input. So what you see, hear, feel, taste, all of those kinds of things bombard us all throughout the day. And so the first part of our memory is just that sensory input. And then what we have to do with that information is pay attention to what is important. So 99% of that information is discarded. You can hear right now, I hear something like vacuuming or something going on. We need to discard that and not let that get into our memory, so we pay attention to that. We have to really pick out what's important. That's the first part that's important for all students, is being able to pick out and remember what is the important information that I need to concentrate on. So that is the very first thing we need to do. Attention is key. And there are things from pre-K through 12th grade that could get in the way of the memory process at that point. It could be a pervasive problem, like if your child has distractibility or any kind of anxiety that could negatively impact being able to pay attention to what's important at school. Or it could be something temporary, like an emotional issue if a grandparent or a pet died. Anything emotional like that could also get in your child's way of paying attention. So that's the very first thing as part of memory and learning that we need to make sure that children are able to do. So once we pay attention to what's important, that information goes into our short-term or working memory, and that's very temporary memory. You can see on this graphic here, it says it lasts 15 to 20 seconds. You can only remember about 7 items, and you need to do something with that information then if you want to get it into your long-term memory. And I think that this is, as our children get older, when they're younger, they're not as responsible for remembering all that information long-term for tests, but as they move into 4th grade, middle school, upper school, students are responsible for learning and remembering more and more information. And I think one downfall of students at this step is making the mistake of thinking that, well, I'll just remember that tomorrow. So I just need to listen. I'm good, I pay attention, I'm interested, I participate. Surely I'll remember this tomorrow. But something that's helpful for our students that I know that 4th grade teachers concentrate on a lot is starting to take notes, writing information down. When you read something, maybe writing a sentence about what you read, so the next day you remember it. And so that's a skill that children need to start learning even as early as 4th grade and build on as they go through the middle and upper school, so that tomorrow when they go to class, they can recall what they read last night. If they don't do something with the information, they're not going to be able to remember it. And so that's another pitfall that might happen with your students, as they're trying to remember and learn for the long term. And so then we're going to talk a little bit now then about how you get things from working memory then into long-term memory, so that your students can recall it later for when they need it, either for a test or for something they're doing in their life, because that's really the point, not just for the test, but later on in life, to be able to use and apply the knowledge they learn. And there's 3 steps here on the bottom that we put that are important to learning and remembering long term. When I talk with teachers, parents, and students about learning and remembering, there's 3 different steps in the process where there could be something going wrong. If the child, if you're like, I'm not really sure what's happening here, it could be one of these 3 areas that's kind of going wrong. The first point is that the children need to understand the information. It seems really, obvious that they need to understand the information, but many of the students, evaluating their own learning is hard for them. Thinking, do I understand this information? Many students wait until the night before a test and they try to study, and then they realize, I don't remember, I don't understand this. And they're trying to learn and remember for the long term, but they don't understand. Well, you can't apply information that you don't understand. So it's really important, starting again from a young age, to help your student think about how I can do a little bit of practice each night, so that every night I can evaluate myself. Do I understand this? If they come across something that they don't understand, they can email their teachers, go in and ask the teacher the next day, before school or during a free bell, and clarify that information so that they can remember it for long term. And that's true for, you know, the youngest of students. We start out, even in kindergarten, with letter sounds, your numbers, math facts, all of those things. Teachers ask the children to space it out every day for that reason. So it's a good habit from a young age to get your child in the habit of doing. You're going to talk about?
Yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about remembering how we can best move information from that short-term memory, working memory, to the long-term memory. And one way, as Stephanie said, we only hold that information for 15-20 seconds without doing something with it, without either rehearsing it or trying to move it into long-term memory. And it's a very short time period. And so the one way that we can move information from that short-term to long-term memory is by doing something with it, by making meaning out of it, and rehearsing it in a way that's going to let us later be able to retrieve that information. So one of the terms used in this is called elaborate rehearsal. And it's essentially making meaning out of what you're learning. And so, for example, we suggest to students to use not just rotely reciting information, but to use different learning modalities to encode the information, to get it from the short-term to the long-term memory. So what that means is using using all your senses, essentially, your visual cues, your auditory cues, your body, your tactile cues, to learn the information in multiple ways. So in the 7th grade, for example, some of the teachers in that particular grade that I know talk about what is your learning style? What style do you prefer to learn in? And so some students might say, I really like to, they might be an auditory, like to listen to things in order to learn them. And that would be a great place to start for your student. So as you're learning the information, let's maybe listen to, listen to the book, or listen to a lecture, or let's talk it out with each other. And then also going beyond that and encouraging them to use the other strategies as well, because the more exposure they have to it in different ways, the more likely it's going to get moved from that short-term memory to the long-term memory.
Right. And in 3rd grade, they talk about what kind of smarts are you. They talk about the multiple intelligences, and the students identify what their preference is. And that is, like Stephanie said, a great place to start is, if I am a kinesthetic learner and a visual learner, maybe walking around and then looking at a picture, but even going beyond that, like Stephanie said, the more ways, the more different kinds of learning styles a student uses to study something, the more solid it will be in their long-term memory. So while we want students to start with whatever their preference is, encourage them to go beyond that and use other styles as well to go over that information again and again in different ways.
Another really important skill that I really stress with my upper school students when I work with them is to make connections with something that you already know. So you're learning something, make connections with something that you already know, to help I kind of use the visual of hooking that information now into your brain, into your long-term memory. And that, this is backed up by multiple evidence and research that we really, if we connect what we're learning to something we already know, we're much more likely to be able to retrieve it later on and remember it and encode it in our memory. So this happens naturally through the curriculum at Country Day, but it also can just happen naturally as well. So one example of that I was thinking as we were preparing for this is in 5th grade, the students learn their countries and their capitals. This is a big thing in social studies, where they learn where all the countries and all the capitals are in the world and are able to identify them on a map. Now we move into 9th grade, where they have world history. They take world history in 9th grade, where they learn about different civilizations and different empires and where those are in the world. If they have some background knowledge about now, what countries look like and where things are, they can then apply this new information of where the Ottoman Empire was or the Roman Empire, and think about in terms of where those things lie, where they fall geographically. But also, they talk a lot about agriculture, how that influences civilizations in terms of if you're close to water, or if if you have access to resources, how that affects civilizations. So, kind of that was just something that kind of popped in my head, honestly, from thinking about that continuity of connecting the information. So, we have some strategies for parents, but I tell students that it's really important to make those connections. Even if it doesn't seem important of what you're learning at the time, you've probably learned something similar to it. It's always, always important to connect that. And it's essentially the rich get richer effect. The more you know, the more you're going to be able then to comprehend and understand and learn.
A lot of times our students think that what they're learning is just isolated information. This has nothing to do with anything else I've done before. And it's helpful, as parents, to help them remember, well, remember when you did that unit on immigration and now you're talking about this again in history in the upper school? You remember how it felt to sit in that simulation, the small boat? How does that apply to now what you're learning? And they might be like, oh yeah, I did learn about that. A lot of times they just think that we're randomly picking information it's not building on anything. But when you bring it up with them and have that discussion, it brings up that background information that we know that they have because they've learned it before, but they are not always able to retrieve it themselves. So helping them hook onto something, and maybe it's something that you've done in your life if you've traveled somewhere that has to do with what they're learning, or you've seen a museum exhibit or a movie. It doesn't have to be something else they've learned in school, but what other background information do they have that they can use to give themselves a context for this new information that they're learning? That's something adults can definitely help children with at all levels.
And I love to see, when I work with students, I love to see them, I try to build that connection, and I love to see when they finally make those connections on their own. It's almost like that light bulb goes off, and you can see it like, oh yeah, okay. And they'll start making those connections on their own. So it's really kind of a cool experience. Just happened the other day. Another really important component of memory is spacing out what we're learning. We often will forget things. If we learn it once, we might remember pieces and parts of it. But if we're again exposed to it multiple times, multiple ways, over specific intervals, then we're more likely to remember it. And this is one purpose of homework, is creating, you learn something in the classroom and then it's reinforced at home and with homework. And sometimes students might not see the benefit of homework, or why do I have to do this again? I just learned about it in the classroom. And part of it is the important exposure, that multiple exposure over time, to be able to then retrieve it later on. In the middle, particularly in 7th and 8th grade, and then in the upper school, this stuff doesn't go away. I mean, they have their exams at the end of the semester. So that's particularly important for these students to have that multiple exposure over time. And what we don't use, we lose eventually. We know that as adults, that, in our specialties or whatever we're interested in, we have a lot of information, and the things that we don't use as much kind of fade away. So part of that is adaptive. We can't always keep everything on the forefront of our brains, but doing interval spacing out practice is really important too.
And we have students, I say, well, cramming works for me. I can learn it tonight and remember it tomorrow. We try to point out to the students, but this is information that you're going to need that's going to build on itself. 2 chapters from now in math, you're going to have to apply the same process. And on the exam, and next year in pre-calc, and then in calculus. It's something that, yes, maybe you can cram and remember it tomorrow, but when you're talking about using this information for the long term, if you really want to be able to effectively do that, spacing over time. So again, from the youngest of ages, getting your children into that habit of doing a little bit each night, so then when they get to 7th, 8th, and 8th grade and the upper school, it's already a habit for them. They already know if I have a social studies test, I start 2-3 days ahead of time, because that's what I do.
And one of the last pieces I want to say in terms of the remembering, and then I'll turn it over to Stephanie for the applying, is that part of what we want to do, especially in the lower grades, is to create automaticity in some certain skills. So particularly in procedures like for example, addition skills. We want them to be automatic in knowing how do I do that, or automatic in knowing their math facts, knowing their sight words, knowing how to decode words. Because that then leaves more, once they have exposure to that and that becomes more automatic, they now have more energy, more mental energy to then apply this information later on in life. So, I mean, just thinking about math, if you have difficulty with simple calculations, you're obviously going to have more difficulty in an algebra class or a calculus class, just because of that. You don't have that automaticity in your skills.
So the first piece, we talked about was, first of all, paying attention and being able to hear the information. Second of all, understanding. The next part was the remembering. Like Stephanie said, I always ask students who, do you remember this well enough to be able to apply it to your test? Are you able? Do you just look at your notes and you're like, oh, I understand this, and stop right there? That's kind of a pitfall for some students. They're like, I understand this, it'll be fine. But they do need to study well enough that they are very automatic with the information, like Stephanie said, because we only have so much cognitive capacity. We only have this much. And if we're spending 75% of our energy saying, oh, I know we talked about that, what was it, trying to remember, we only have 25% left to then apply it to the difficult questions that are asked of the students, the essay questions, the short answer questions. But if you're very automatic with the information, for example, if, say in science, the teacher says compare and contrast these two terms. Well, the first thing you have to be able to do is know what those two terms are before you can pick out the similarities and differences and write about it. So the automaticity part is very, it's very important. Like she said, we work on this, again, from the youngest of ages with math facts, sight words, but also it's important all the way through the upper school. I know in earth science, for example, in 9th grade, there's a lot of terms, new terms that students haven't learned before, and really that's kind of rote memory, just remembering those terms so that they can then apply it on the test. And again, that is the ultimate goal of our education, is that application. A great example that I've read before about making, just kind of understanding what that means is the idea of a jazz musician. Music students go through school and they learn scales and they learn notes and they might have to memorize pieces, and they can be very impressive in performances just remembering a piece. But if you see a jazz musician, or for students that I talk to more, students or musicians who jam on stage with other musicians and just make it up on the spot, they're taking that knowledge that they remembered and applying it to something new. They're coming up with something on the spot, this new music that just blows us away. We're like, wow, how can they do that? Well, they can do that because they've studied so well and remembered that music to make it even more impressive and apply it to a new situation. And that really is the point of our education. But you need to have these foundational steps beforehand. Another example of that is in the foreign language program. Many of our students think that, if they just kind of look over the vocabulary, look over the grammar rules, yes, I understand this, I should be able to translate on a test. But it's really important that they study the vocabulary until they remember it fluently, the grammar rules until they can just pick them out very easily to then be able to translate on a test and apply that knowledge. So if your student is having trouble at any level, you might look at where is this breaking down for them? Is it the attention, the understanding, studying well enough to remember, or is it then the application? And I think I know a lot of pre-K parents are here, and you might be like, how does this apply to me? But one thing you can do at this age with your pre-K students is just talking about what they do every day. That's the elaborative rehearsal that Stephanie was talking about. Talking about what'd you do today, what'd you learn? Oh, you're studying animals? Well, what's your favorite animal? Like, why do you like that animal? Where do they live? And just talking about those kinds of things with them. That is elaborative rehearsal at that age too. So it's something you can get in the habit of doing.
So on the back sheet, there was some more practical, kind of gave you an overview of how memory works. And now on the back is some more practical tips for parents on what what any parent can do at home for their students. And we hit on a lot of these as we were talking. Number 4 has some specifics on how to use the different learning modalities, as I had mentioned, using the auditory, the visual, the tactile, or kinesthetic ideas. And there's so many ways that students can get information. It's kind of cool, that we have computers and access to teachers, and there's so many ways, you guys, so many ways to get information. And so these are some examples of how you could do that. And some students on like letter G are really maybe more musical, and that's more with Gardner's intelligences, and maybe singing a song to learn something, or using that strategy can be really helpful. Putting something to a rhyme can be really helpful. And because, I mean, for example, I learned The Colors of the Rainbow just by Roy G. Biv. That's how I still remember The Colors of the Rainbow, just by having that mnemonic device. So there's certain things that can really help them pull that information out when they need it.
And I've even had upper school students who have just never, sometimes they've heard this before, but they need to hear it again. And they're like, I am very musical. I tried your strategy of setting this information in music, and it actually helped me remember. That was the hook that helped them be able to pull that information back out of long-term memory when it came time to remembering and applying that information. So, they've heard this before. They hear it throughout with the learning styles and multiple intelligences, but sometimes they need reminders as they go through.
And number 7, if you get